Begin? Okay. Again, another thank you to the OU for inviting me to give this shiur, and thank everybody for joining us. Let's do a quick recap of the previous shiur. We began with a controversy which began. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. We began with a controversy. We're talking about 45 years ago. The director of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, Professor Meir, sends a question to the posek of the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, Rabbi Waldenberg, the author of the Tzitz Eliezer. Can we abort babies that have been detected, or can we abort fetuses that have been detected to have Tay-Sachs disease? Okay, Rabbi Waldenberg permitted it up to the 7th month.
Quick comment.
Sure.
At the same time that they developed the test for in utero, they developed the test for caries.
Oh,
and in fact, it was in Philadelphia. I was living at the time.
Okay.
And there was a huge campaign to get people tested to see whether they were carrier.
Okay, thank you for adding that. I don't know your name. Ellie. Okay, Ellie pointed out that just as they had developed technology to the fetal testing to determine, which according to the tshuva, they could detect that the fetus had Tay-Sachs after the 3rd month of pregnancy. That was the same time that they started the genetic testing, or they had the means to do the genetic testing. And this, as we talked about last week, generated a controversy. Rav Moshe Feinstein was strongly opposed. Rav Moshe Feinstein held that this was tantamount to Ritzicha. Okay, we talked about another 3 cases. We talked about the case of the Sridei Eish. I did try to find out what year it was. I couldn't ascertain the exact year that this tshuva had been written by the Sridei Eish. It could have been anywhere between 80 years ago and 100 years ago. Again, at the time, according to British law, British doctors were obligated by law to abort babies if the mother had contracted German measles or rubella during the pregnancy, which created a very high likelihood that the child that was born from that pregnancy would be extremely retarded or have other major birth defects. That was the other case we talked about. We also talked about the case that I had read in a tshuva 20 years ago. I don't have a source for that, about the case where the doctors wanted to abort a baby because there were certain stem cells, certain life-saving ingredients that could save the 9-year-old brother that had leukemia. The 4th case that we talked about, also, I couldn't give you a source. I'm speaking from memory. I think I said that if I remember correctly, Rabbi Unterman was asked by a doctor in the camps. He was ordered by a German officer to abort a baby. The German officer had impregnated the girl. The question was, obviously if he didn't heed the instructions of the German officer, he could lose his life. What was the right thing to do? Those are the 4 cases that we talked about. We're going to get back to all of these 4 cases. We saw that the major consensus, the overwhelming consensus amongst the Rishonim was Uber Lav Nefesh. A fetus is not a nefesh, however we describe nefesh. Nefesh is a soul, a full human being. He's not a nefesh. That was derived first and foremost from the pasuk, from the Chumash, Shmois Perikov Aleph, Anoshim Nokvi Ishar. We're talking about somebody that causes a woman to miscarry in the midst of a fist fight. The Torah says, Lo Ya'ason. The Torah doesn't consider this a loss of life. This was also derived from the Gemara in Nida Daf Mem Daled. It says, Ish Kiyaka Kol Nefesh. The pasuk says, Kol Nefesh. A person is liable to the death penalty for committing murder, any form of nefesh. The Gemara says that includes only a child from 1 day old and onwards, which the clear inference is that if it's a fetus, it's not considered a nefesh. We said that was the overwhelming consensus amongst the Rishonim, including the Achronim. We mentioned the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Beis, that describes the Mishnah Oholos, Perik Zayin, Mishnah Vov, a woman that's going through a dangerous childbirth. So the Mishnah instructs that the midwife or whoever else instructed is to kill the baby whilst the fetus is in the uterus to save the mother's life. The Mishnah there says that the moment the baby exits its head out of the uterus, then the baby is not to be touched. She'ein doichin nefesh mitnei nefesh. The inference is that once the child sticks his head out, he is regarded as a nefesh. Right? So therefore, his life is treated equally as the mother's life. Okay? That is a quick summary of yesterday's shir. Okay? We were right in the middle of looking at the Gemara in Eruchin Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Okay? If you look at your reference sheets, that's reference number 4. Okay, so we saw a number of important points there in the Gemara in Eruchin. First point, a woman is being executed. So the Mishnah says we don't wait for the woman to give birth. Ha'isha sheyotza l'harg ein mamtina la'ad shetela de'isha. We don't wait. Sheyashva la'mashper. But once the woman goes into labor, okay, we talked a little bit about what labor is. The Gemara in Kuf Chav Ches in Shabbos gives three criteria as to what labor, what is the start of labor. Either when there's a discharge of blood, number 1, right? Number 2, when she sits on the birthing stool, or number 3, when she needs to be supported by her friends, she's in a very weakened state. Okay? So once she goes into labor, we wait. We said that the Gemara said that should be obvious. It should be obvious that we don't wait unless a woman is in labor. But before one goes into labor, it should be obvious that we don't wait for the woman to give birth. The Gemara says, Gufahi, the fetus is part of the mother's body. Okay? So the Gemara says, nonetheless, I may have thought that we should wait because in addition to being part of the woman's body, it's also property of the husband. Okay? The fetus belongs jointly both by the mother and by the father. So the Gemara says there's a special pasuk, Asher Yashid Alav Balaisha Mimane Debalhu. I might think that I should wait because it's the property of the husband. So the Gemara says no, Umeitu Gam Shneim L'Ravet Tavlad. There is a certain redundancy in the Torah, Umeitu Gam Shneim, both should die. Now according to the simple interpretation, the pasuk Umeitu Gam Shneim is referring to the adulterer and the adulteress. However, on a more midrashic level, Umeitu Gam Shneim is also coming to insinuate that the fetus is put to death, even though it's property of the father. Okay? Now, if we look at the Gemara there, we'll continue on learning this Gemara together. So the Gemara says, Hayisha hayotza lihareg. Okay, we're talking about halfway down the Gemara there, the first section. Hayisha hayotza lihareg makan oto keneged beiteron. You basically hit the area of the above the uterus, you hit the tummy of the woman in order to abort the baby. So we perform an abortion in order to uphold the dignity of the woman. Okay, the Rabbi Gershom, there's a few explanations, we'll go with explanation of Rabbi Gershom here on the daf, that if a woman is unfortunately executed and then she gives birth, there's a lot of blood, it's very messy, it's considered a lack of dignity, so in order to uphold the dignity, we abort the baby and then we execute the woman. So you see that the Gemara has permitted an abortion in order to uphold the dignity of the woman. Okay? Which brings us to the next point in the Gemara, right? Let's go down towards the bottom section of the Gemara. Omer Shmuel, very important Gemara. Aisha shiyash falamashber, woman has gone into labor. Umeit, unfortunately she dies in childbirth. B'Shabbos, on Shabbat, mevi'in sakin, you take a knife, umakrina takresa, you open up, right? You open up the uterus, umatzina tavlad, you take the child out. So in other words, you do something that would have otherwise been considered a desecration of the Shabbos in order to save the life of the fetus. So Mar says, Pshita, that's obvious. So the Gemara says, "My Ovid, machatech b'basra." What Shabbos desecration could this theoretically involve? Cutting meat is not a violation of the Shabbos. That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara says, it's the right is coming to permit one to carry a knife via a public domain. Right? Carrying an item, carrying a utensil via a public domain, 4 amas, 4 cubits. That's normally desecration of the Shabbos. That is permitted in order to save the life of the fetus. So the Gemara says, even though it is not certain that the life of the fetus could be saved, but It's a well-known principle. Even if there's a chance that you could save a life, that justifies what would otherwise be a desecration of the Shabbos. Okay? Those are the principles. So there are 3 important principles, or maybe 4 important principles that we have to bear in mind that have been extracted from the Gemara. Number 1, the Gemara is telling us that the fetus is gufa, it's part of the woman's body. It's considered the woman's body, which ostensibly means that it's not a nefesh, supporting the previous premise. Number 2, right, the second important principle is that we're allowed to perform an abortion in order to uphold the dignity of the woman. Number 3, right, that we saw last week, that once the woman goes into labor, then we do not execute the child, which means to say that something critical happens at the point of labor, the status of the fetus changes. That's number 3. And number 4, Mechalin Shabbat, we do what would otherwise be a desecration of the Shabbos in order to save the life of the fetus. Those are the important 4 critical principles that will come into play in the continuation of the Gemara. Right? There's a important Ramban in Tarat Adam, Shar HaMechush in Sakana. Okay, in your reference sheet, that's number 25. Okay, the Ramban asks the obvious question: if a fetus is not a nefesh, why would we permit desecrating the Shabbos in order to save the fetus? So the Ramban says he's not a nefesh, but he carries the potential to be a nefesh. Right? He invokes the important principle of Chalel Shabbat Achad Kidei Sheyishmu Shabbatot Harbei. It's a worthwhile investment to desecrate one Shabbat so that many Shabbatot in the future could be observed. The bottom line of the Ramban, and that's the critical point, Hilkach. All right, the bottom line in reference number 25 in your reference sheet. This is the wording of the Ramban. Hilkach hafilu b'hatzalat ubar pachot miben arba'im yom. Even if the uber, right, is still within the first 40 days after conception, which the Gemara we'll see the condition of the Gemara. The Gemara will say it's Maya Ba'alma. Okay, we'll see the Gemara in Yevamot, Taf Samachet. We'll see that in the future, that the first 40 days the fetus is regarded as nothing more than water. Okay, that's what the Gemara asserts. But nevertheless, you could still be Machal Shabbat. She'ein lochiyut klal mechalov kedat bal halachot. Invokes the bal halachot. This is the accepted opinion in the Rishonim. It's also in the Rosh, in the 8th parak of Yuma, Simin Gimel. The Ran in Yuma brings this, and this is also the ruling of the Ber Aloch and Simin Shin Lamed Tziv Zayin, that you are mechalel Shabbat in order to save. I don't know if you can call it a fetus yet, right? But you can call it perhaps a potential fetus, even to save a fertilized egg, if you'd like. You are Mechalel Shabbat. In fact, there's an interesting shuvah of Rav Vosner, right? He says that, are you allowed to Mechalel Shabbat in order to preserve a fertilized egg? Right? An interesting shuvah. Okay? Ostensibly, yes. Yeah?
But in this case, with Gemara, it's only from the moment she goes into labor.
Right.
Right, not prior to that.
So the moment that she goes into labor, we'll see that the fetus has an upgrade in status. Right. According to the Rambam, we'll see that it has the status of a fetus, but to be Mechalel the Shabbat, it does not need to have the status of a nefesh. The fact that it carries the potential for life, that is enough to justify what would otherwise be the desecration of the Shabbos. Okay? So that's the principle of the Ramban. And again, the Ramban is aligning with his reasoning. The Ramban belonged to the school that said explicitly that uber lav nefeshu, an uber is not a nefesh. So therefore, he needed to explain why you would be allowed to Mechalel Shabbat. Again, if you were to regard the fetus as a nefesh, then you would not need to have a justification as to why you're allowed to Mechalel Shabbat. It is only because the Ramban does not consider the Uber Nefesh that he needed to come up with a reasoning as to why you would be permitted to Mechalel Shabbat. Okay? Now, according to this school of Rishonim, it should be quite straightforward that you can kill a fetus in order to save a life. Okay? It should be quite straightforward that if, for example, take the case where you want to abort a fetus to extract some vital component in order to save a life, to save somebody with leukemia, it should be quite straightforward that that's permissible. Okay, because it's not murder. Okay? I'm saying this.
Required.
Sorry?
Permissible or required?
Required, I would add. Yes. Good point, because lotamat adam reyacha, exactly, it should even be required.
The case of the woman who's having difficulty in childbirth, you consider the ubar as a rodef.
Oh, very good.
Which would not be the case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Key point, right? As Eli pointed out, right, that when we're dealing with a child, the 9-year-old child needs some component from the fetus. This fetus does not have the status of a rodef. He's completely passive. In order to assume the status of a rodef, you have to actively be doing something to put somebody else into danger. The fetus does not have the status of a rodef. Now, it should be simple. The reason why it becomes complicated is because of the Rambam. Okay? The Rambam makes things very, very complicated. Now, we could ignore the Rambam, as the Sridei Eish suggested, because we have already the majority of the Rishonim, but the Rambam cannot be entirely ignored because in Choshen Mishpah, the Shulchan Aruch in Tav Chav Hey, the Shulchan Aruch copies the Rambam word for word, so therefore we have to take the Rambam more seriously, even though he might be in the minority. Okay? Says the Rambam, this is number 28 on your reference sheet, says the Rambam, Harezu mitzvat lo tasei shelo lechus al nefesh haroidef. There's a lot to say not to have compassion on a rodef. Okay, this comes into play in the IDF especially. This is a very important moral question, right? Armies have to deal with this all the time. But by not having mercy on a rodef, right, you are avoiding the violation of a mitzvah, because the Torah commands specifically not to have mercy on a rodef. Lefikach, therefore, if you have a woman that's in a life-threatening situation as a result of her giving birth, mutter lach teicha uber. It's funny that the Rambam says mutter. You should. It's something. It is a ha'ara. Right? It's something to be noted. Why did the Rambam say mutter lach teicha uber? Perhaps the Rambam should have said chayiv lach teicha uber. Okay, I don't have an explanation as to why the Rambam says mutter lach teicha uber. According to what you said, perhaps the Rambam should have said chayiv lach teicha uber b'me'ah. Bein b'sam, whether it's by using some medicinal, by some medicine, bein biyad, or whether it's done manually, mitnei shehu korodav achar lahargo, because the baby, the fetus inside, is a rodef. He's causing the mother to be in a life-threatening situation. Says the Rabbi, but once the child exits its head out of the uterus, you're not allowed to touch the child. He's a nefesh, she's a nefesh. Right? You cannot play favoritism. You cannot kill the child in order to save the life of the mother. Says Rambam. Says the Rambam. Now the Rambam is extremely difficult. There are two very great difficulties with the Rambam. The first difficulty of the Rambam is that we saw the Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis that stated explicitly that a fetus is not a rodef. Right? The wording of the Gemara was Mishamaya Karat Filei. It's heaven that's causing this to happen. So that's the first difficulty. Sorry?
Why he says kirodef.
Kirodef, very good. Another point, it says kirodef. But in any case, the Gemara said Mishamaya Karat Filei. Right? The Gemara stated what seemed to be quite explicit. The child does not have a status of the rodef. The Rambam says he does have a status of the rodef. That's the first difficulty for the Rambam. And obviously the implications are huge, right? As some of you pointed out. It has huge implications. According to the Rambam, to take the life of the fetus, he has to have the status of a rodef. Yeah. So if you, let's deal with a case. They want to get some component, right, from the fetus in order to save the life of the 9-year-old boy that has leukemia. According to other Rishonim, it's fine. According to the Rambam, ostensibly it's not okay, because the Rambam stated that we only take his life because he has the status as a rodef. In this case, the child is completely passive. He doesn't have the status of a rodef. The implications are very great, right? Do you say that you can take the life of a fetus because he's not a nefesh? Or do you also need that the child has the status of the rodef? The Rambam seems to say in contradiction with the Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis that he needs to have the status of the rodef. That's the first difficulty. The second very great difficulty with the Rambam is, if the child has the status of a rodef while he's inside the uterus, By that same token, should he not also have a status as a rodif after he already exits his head out? What happened? When the child is inside, the Rambam said he has the status of a rodif. Once he's out, he's not a rodif. What changed? Okay, those are the two great difficulties of the Rambam. The Minchas Chinuch, when he was analyzing this Rambam, said he was very surprised to see that none of the Inosa Kelim, none of the commentaries on the Rambam raised this difficulty. Right? This, I believe, the first person to have raised the difficulties is the Maharal on the Gur Aryeh in Shmot Perek Chaf Aleph. We saw this Gur Aryeh previously, where the Gur Aryeh stated that the child does not have the status of nefesh until he's yotzala avira olam, until he actually exists and he breathes the air of the world. He is not considered a nefesh. That's the wording of Rashi and many other Rishonim. Rashi in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis. The Maral, in our prints, it says the Ramban. Okay, it's clearly a mistake. I haven't seen it it has not been corrected, but it should be corrected. It's the Harambam. Right? The Gur Aryeh has a major issue with the Rambam. Again, the Gur Aryeh, in reference number 30, right? He says, "Kol zman sholetz alav ha'olam," he's not a nefesh. Shenikra az uber imay, he's part of the mother. He's part of the mother's body. Well, a nefesh adam, he's not the nefesh of adam. And once he goes out, ein doich nefesh mitnei nefesh. V'harambam pirush b'hach mishnah ki sholetz alav ha'olam v'chat chnoisit hamach. The Rambam gave some other reasoning. And it's not correct. Ikar Pirush Commercial Market. He was clearly bothered by this. Okay? Many Achronim have been bothered by this. The Chavod Yair, which was a very central player in this whole issue of abortion, we're going to mention a few points that the Chavod Yair raises. Okay? The Pnei Yeshua, the Shut Pnei Yeshua, which, as an aside, is not to be confused with the Pnei Yeshua Lashas. The Pnei Yeshua Lashas, this Pnei Yeshua Shutner was a grandfather, or great-grandfather. He was Rabbi Yeshua Harif of Krakow. He was a great-grandfather, or grandfather of Yeshua Polak, who wrote the famous Pnei Yeshua on the Shas. The Pnei Yeshua was a strong backer of the Yavitz in his war with Rav Yonason Eibeshitz. Okay, as an aside, that's the grandson. Okay, Rav Yeshua Pick was one of the Gedolei Olam. He was writing about abortion to the Rabbi Yehuda. He raised the difficulty. Reb Kiva Eger, the Tosas Reb Kiva Eger on the Mishnah raises the difficulty. The Maram Shik, the Pischei Tshuva, the Minchas Chinuch, Reb Chaim Halevi, Aruch HaShulchan, and I'm assuming many more Achronim have raised this difficulty. What's interesting is that the Rabbi Yehuda throws his hands up. He says, I have no clear understanding of this Rambam. To give an answer that's a dochak, that's not very, it's a bit of a stretch. Why in the previous generations have already attempted to give a poor answer, a poor explanation of the Rambam, and therefore I'm not interested in attempting. He acknowledges that he doesn't have a good explanation of this Rambam. Okay, and as I mentioned last year, that if you people that study Rambam, if you ask them what great difficult Rambams come to mind, I'm pretty confident that this Rambam, if he's an expert Rambam, this Rambam will come up, right, with the thing.
Rav, can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
Because maybe this is connected, and it's not a situation, and I think it actually happened with conjoined twins.
Conjoined, yes.
Where they found out in utero that the one was going to be a sakana for the other, and only one could survive.
Yes.
So if you terminate the one twin, the other one has a better chance of survival.
Yeah.
But do you wait till they both are born, and then because then it takes different status?
Yeah, good question. So Dr. Les is asking about conjoined twins, or otherwise known as Siamese twins. In most cases, right, it depends where the twins are conjoined. In most cases, you can say both. Okay, but if they're conjoined at the heart or other critical organs, oftentimes the doctors have to choose the life of one of the two. Okay, there were only 2 such cases, or recorded cases in Israeli hospitals. Okay, I think one was in Shiva Hospital. According to what I read, this happened twice. The question was brought to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein said that, if I recall correctly, he said that this was the most challenging question that had ever come before him. He said I think if I remember correctly, he had to lock himself in a room for 2 or 3 days because he very eagerly wanted to come up with grounds to permit the procedure so that at least one of the twins, but have you choose one over the other. Okay? So I'm not familiar with the actual in and outs of the tshuva, but the final ruling of Moshe is that that he permitted performing the surgery, right? And he said that the weaker tin has the status of a rodif, which is again is a tremendous novelty, because we always assume that you cannot assume the status of a rodif if you're completely passive. Okay, so lots to get to. That's something that we'll deal with, but definitely a very interesting, tshuva. Okay, so there's a Reb Chaim Halevi. Reb Chaim Halevi came up with a very, very original explanation of the Rambam. Unfortunately, this Reb Chaim Halevi is so difficult. The Reb Chaim Halevi, in my humble opinion, is actually more difficult than the Rambam. Okay, the Even HaOzel, his student, Rav Isra Zalman Meltz, already points out that there are many difficulties with this explanation. The Sri Eish points out that the explanation of Reb Chaim simply does not fit the language of the Rambam. I'm happy to go through the whole explanation of Rav Chaim, maybe after the shir if anybody's interested. I have Baruch Hashem 3 svarim. I have a very long tshuva specifically on this Rav Chaim, to discuss the Rav Chaim, but I'm going to choose to pass over it because it's so difficult and I don't want to confuse anybody anymore, which, excuse me for a moment, I did give, based on the feedback of what we heard in the last year, we will make a synopsis, okay? As I pointed out, that the shir is divided up into 6 sections. The first section of the shir we've already finished, right? That's the consensus of the Rishonim. How do most Rishonim how do they regard a fetus? We said that most Rishonim do not regard the fetus as a nefesh, okay? The second section of the shir, which we're dealing with now, is the sheet of the Rambam. The third section of the shir, which is perhaps the most important part of the shir, is that we're going to determine why exactly is abortion forbidden. Okay? So please bear with me. I also encourage everybody that if anybody wants to, that this is probably going to be three shiurim are going to be devoted to this topic. Thanks to Dr. Les, we have everything recorded on YouTube and it's going to be put up on the OU site. I strongly encourage everybody to, if you wish to see all 3 sections of the shir, because everything needs to be seen in context. It's important to see the entire context, because if things are taken out of context, it could be very misleading, right? The first section of the shir, it could sound like we're advocating, a nefesh, the fetus is not a nefesh, there's no issue to kill it, it's not murder. And then maybe in the third section of the shir, you might get the impression that we're saying that this is, right? So in other words, this is a very nuanced subject, okay? And things could easily be taken out of context. Okay, so again, I just forgot to mention these 2 points based on some of the feedback that I got after the first shir. Okay, so repeat myself. Number 1, please see everything in context, preferably see all 3 shiurim. And number 2, we are going to organize things at the end. We're going to see everything, hopefully all the major things that there are to be seen on this topic, but in the end we're going to very neatly organize the different sheets, the different opinions, and how we actually relate to abortion. So, if I may, I'm going to pass over the explanation of Reb Chaim Halevi. You can either discuss it with me after the show, or you can have a look at my sefer. I'm happy to provide you with a copy. I'd rather get to the explanation of Reb Moshe Feinstein. Okay, Reb Moshe Feinstein Choshemish, but again in the same tshuva where he takes major issue with the Tzitz Eliezer, where he accuses the Tzitz Eliezer of having permitted murder. Okay, so the Reb Moshe Feinstein quotes the Yerushalmi. I didn't put the Yerushalmi on the reference sheet last week, and then I had second doubts. I said maybe it should have been put on the reference sheet, so I gave you another reference sheet, which are different references that I added, okay, today. So it's actually the first in the supplementary reference sheet, right? For that, it's actually the first thing, okay? The Talmud Yerushalmi, right? This is the Talmud Yerushalmi appears in 2 places. In number 1 in Masechet Shabbat, Perek Yudaled, also in Avodah Zarah, Perek Beis. He begins with the same question the Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis began with.
Where are you reading right now?
Sorry?
Where are you reading?
I'm reading from the supplementary sheet. You didn't get one?
Sheets.
Oh, you were supposed to receive a supplementary. Okay, somebody's been kind enough to get you. Okay? Somebody's bringing, okay? Sorry about that. I was hoping the second. Excuse me for a moment. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol.
Amen.
Okay? We're going to wait till he brings the sheet in. You know what? Here, take my sheet, because I know it all by heart. Okay. I have to be honest, I don't know it by heart, but I have it written on my reference sheet. I have it written here. Okay, thank you very much. So the Yerushalmi, 2 places in Shabbat and Avodah Zarah, Rav Chisda Bo Malatz Nafsh Shekol. The Yerushalmi begins with the same question, dealing with the question of road. If you have a child, we'll call him Ruvain, is chasing an adult, we'll call him Shimon. Can you kill Ruvain, the child, in order to save the life of Shimon? Can a child also have the status of Rodev? So the Gemara asks, "Hey to Rav Yirmiyah v'loy matnino hayatz Ruvain noigim b'shein derech nefesh nefesh." If a woman's in birth, after the child's exited the head, you can't touch the child. So apparently, a child cannot assume the status of Rodev. The Bavli answered Mishamai Karat Falei, but the Yerushalmi gave what could be a different answer. The Yerushalmi answers, She'ein at yodeh mi haraget mi. How do you know who's the Rodef? Who's killing? Who's attempting to kill who? Is it the mother that's being Rodef the child, or is it the child that's being Rodef the mother? Is that clear? How do you determine who's the Rodef?
As opposed to this case where it's clear.
Sorry?
In this case, it is clear.
Well, the Yerushalmi asserts that once the child has exited his head.
The case here is where a katan is chasing.
Yes, correct. When Ruvain, the child, is chasing Shimon, the adult, it's very clear who the Rodef is. But once a child's exited his head, it's no longer clear who the Rodef is. That's the Yerushalmi. So Moshe Feinstein wants to say, it's a great chidush, and it's a stretch, that the Bavli and the Yerushalmi are really saying the same thing. And when the Bavli says Mishamaya Karat Falei, it means that heaven is causing a situation where both the mother and the child are being rodef each other. Okay, that's step number 1 in Rav Moshe Feinstein's chidush, which is a stretch. Mishamaya Karat Falei, the Ram didn't say that. The Ram said Mishamaya means to say that it's a natural course of events. That a woman being in a life-threatening situation during birth is something that heaven caused. The Rambam said that's nature. Okay? Rav Moshe Feinstein is stretching it and saying, no, it means that heaven caused that you cannot ascertain who is being rolled of who. Okay, that's step number 1. Step number 2, Rav Moshe Feinstein wants to say, an uber is a nefesh, according to the Rambam, contrary to everything that we've seen until now. Rav Moshe Feinstein say, with all due respect to the Ramban and the Rosh and Rashi and the Ritva and the Rajba and all the other poskim, with all due respect to them, the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with the Rambam, and according to the Rambam, an uber is a nefesh. He is considered alive, and therefore, according to the Rambam, if you kill a nefesh, like if you kill an uber, that's murder, that's ritzicha mamish. However, says Rav Moshe, that he's a nefesh, I'm going to speak in very ambiguous terms because I have no other choice. Rav Moshe says that an uber is a nefesh on this level. It's ritzicha gomer, it's pure murder to kill him. But the mother is a nefesh of an even greater level. Is that clear? So they're both a nefesh, but the mother is more of a nefesh. It's relative. You have a nefesh, but a nefesh is relative. You have a nefesh that's this nefesh, and they have a nefesh which is this nefesh. Okay? And he says that when the child is inside, he has the status of a rodev, because on this part, right, on the section where the mother is a greater nefesh, he is a rodev on whatever part of the mother is a greater nefesh than he is. Did we follow that? The uber is here, the mother is here. On this entire part, he is a rodev. And that's why he could be killed in the uterus. Once he sticks his head out, then he and the mother have now reached equal footing. They're now on the same level. So now that they're on the same level, you invoke the principle of the Yerushalmi. How do you know who's being rolled of who?
So there are only 2 levels.
That's right, 2 levels.
It's not a continuum.
Right, exactly. They're both a nefesh. It's complete ritzicha to kill a child, because he is a nefesh, but the mother's an even greater nefesh. That's Rav Moshe Feinstein's reconciliation of the Rambam. Okay? So therefore, according to this, you still need the child to have the status of a rodev. If the child is completely passive, and he's in his mother's tummy, In the case where he's endangering the mother, he's a rodef on whatever section the mother is above the child. But when he's sitting passively in the womb, you can't kill him, because in that case he's not a rodef. He's not a rodef at all. Not on this section, not on this section. That's Rav Moshe Feinstein's reconciliation of the Rambam. Did we follow? Okay. Fair enough. Now the thing is like this. To accept Rav Moshe Feinstein's explanation of the Rambam, you have to make a stretch. You have to, first of all, I find it hard to accept the explanation of Rav Moshe Feinstein because the Rambam already said what Mishalai Karat Fulei. Tiva Shel Olam. It's a natural course of events. He didn't say that in heaven they caused a scenario where you cannot determine who's being rode of who. I consider that a very great difficulty with Rav Moshe Feinstein's explanation. Therefore, which leads me to the explanation of the Achiezer. Okay, I'd like to make a very strong case, humbly make a very strong case in favor of the Achiezer's explanation of the Rambam. Now, the Achiezer was Rav Chaim Ozer Grudensky. If you allow me to digress, I'd like to just talk a little bit about who this man was. Rav Chaim Ozer Grudensky was the leader of Torah Jewry until his passing in the year 1940, which was in the midst of the Holocaust. Okay, Lithuania, until the end of Rav Chaim Ozer Grudensky's life, the Lita, right, still had some level of autonomy. There was some arrangement with the Germans and the Russians, and that's not important. And there was a great influx of yeshivot that came in from Poland and Ukraine and Russia that came as refugees to Lita. He was overseeing the entire operation of taking care of these refugees. His end of his life was very tragic times, and he bore the sole responsibility of much of Jewry at the time. He was a very great genius. Okay, there is a Rosh Yeshiva in Beit Vagan. His name is Rabbi Ben Porat. He has a yeshiva Ashriya-ish. He's actually not Sephardi. He's actually Ashkenazi, even though he has the name Ben Porat. I had a chat with Rabbi Ben Porat. Rabbi Ben Porat told me that his father-in-law knew Rav Chaim Ozer Grudensky. And Rabbi Ben Porat's father-in-law said, I saw Rav Chaim Ozer Grudensky holding a pen in his right hand, holding a pen in his left hand. He was ambidextrous, and he was simultaneously writing two tshuvot. And he said at the same time, right, he was answering halachic queries that were coming in. So he was an exceptional genius. I personally would have not believed the story, but I'm inclined to believe it because Rabbi Ben Porat said that he heard it from his father-in-law who witnessed this. Okay, in any case, he was a very, very great genius. My Rabbi, Rabbi Riv Ozer, was the Rosh Yeshiva of Itri. He has a chavruta, he has a learning partner with Shlomo Fisher, one of the great Talmudic minds of a generation. Worthwhile to get to know him. They had a chavruta, they had a partnership learning the Sefer Achiezer, the Tshuvot of Rav Chaim Ozer Grudensky. Rav Ozer told me that every single line in the Achiezer is a gold mine. Right? He said that this Sefer, it's a very hard Sefer to learn. I read an article from Chaim Shapiro about the conditions under which Rav Chaim Ozer wrote his Sefer Achiezer, which is absolutely remarkable. He had an only child, a daughter that got ill at the age of 17. Unfortunately, she passed away at the age of 20. He was writing the Sefer and also overseeing much of Jewry in Europe, right, under these trying circumstances while his only child was unfortunately dying and she passed away. He was suffering from cancer, which he didn't tell anybody. So really a remarkable fellow, a towering luminary, a man of great piety and genius. So with that introduction, I say that, yeah?
Isn't he the reason why we have gelatin in Israel? He marketed gelatin.
Yeah, the gelatin, I think, is the Kovner Rov. Rabbi Yitzchak Achon Inspector, I think, wrote what was the great breakthrough, what we call the breakthrough truth on gelatin. Okay, that was, I think, he gets. But yes, the Achiezer does have a truth on gelatin, but Achon Inspector had lived earlier than Rav Chaim Ozer, and he had already written a truth on the topic of gelatin. But yes, okay. By the way, as an aside, gelatin is kosher, 100% kosher. If it's clean, pig gelatin is kosher. Okay, it's pretty. That's a strong case to be made on that. Which, thank you for mentioning that. That puts another thing on the list of controversy that I hope to get to. Okay, but there's just so many, right? And each one will take about 3 classes. So please bear with us. They're all interesting. They're all fascinating. Okay. Yeah. So this is the Achiezer. Okay. First of all, the Achiezer says the Achiezer's explanation of the Rambam. Okay, first of all, the Rambam, we said the Svara that the child is a rodef. The first difficulty with the Rambam is that the Rambam contradicts the Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Ayin Beis said the child is not a rodef. Mishamaya Karat Filei, the Rambam contradicts the Gemara and says that he is a rodef. Says Reb Chaim Ozer Grudensky, that's not difficult at all. The Gemara, right, was talking about before Akar Havlad. If you recall, we saw the Gemara in Erech and Dav Zayin that says that once the woman goes into labor, the status of the fetus changes. Okay? So he says, when the Gemara said that he's not a rodef, right? Excuse me, let me start again. I want to reword that. I want to say that differently. The Gemara said that the child has a status of a rodef after his head exits. Okay? The Rambam said that he's a rodef before he exits. Okay? So in other words, when the child exits, according to most Rishonim, the major change that happens is that the fetus went from not having the status of a nefesh. As soon as he exits, he has the status of a nefesh. According to Rambam, that's not the major change. The child has the status of a nefesh from the moment that the woman goes into labor, or otherwise described in the Gemara Erech and Dav Zayin, Akar Havlad, which, translated freely, means that the child uprooted himself to exit from the womb. The moment that the child is Akar, he has the status of a nefesh. Okay, Tosfos makes the same point. Tosfos also in Nida Mem Dalid, in Erech and Dav Zayin, the Tosfos also makes the point that once the child is Akar, he has a different status. Okay? The reason why Tosfos explains, the reason is because the child is now able to live without the mother. Before the child is Akar, the child is completely dependent on the mother for survival. After he already makes a rudal, if you'd like, if he uproots himself to exit, he could potentially survive without the mother. That's the premise that's...
Even while still in the womb?
Which means to say that he could be extracted by C-section, right? Or, if the mother dies, he could be extracted alive. But if the mother dies before she goes into labor, there's no chance that the child could be extracted alive. I'm not sure if that reconciles with modern medical practice or not, but at least let's consider this the reality as asserted by Tosfot in the times of the Talmud. Okay? So, says the Achiezer, the Rambam is not in radical disagreement with the other Rishonim. The Rambam agrees that for most of the pregnancy, the child is not a nefesh. And in fact, it's quite compelling. It's almost a pasuk in the Torah. The pasuk says that if a woman miscarries, if when somebody causes a woman to miscarry in the midst of a fist fight, it's not an ason, it's not a loss of life. The Gemara in Ida, we saw the Gemara in Ida says that nefesh koldu is only once the child is born. The Rambam is not going to disagree with the pasuk. The Rambam is not going to disagree with the vast majority of Rishonim. The Rambam, unlike Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Moshe Feinstein mentions the Achiezer, disagrees with him, but here I'd humbly like to make a compelling case more in favor of the Achiezer. Okay, the Achiezer, and also there's a rule, right? It's repeated a few times in Shas. We don't make a machloket greater than we need to. In other words, unless you have a compelling proof, you don't assume that the two opinions are disagreeing radically. You assume that they disagree about less as opposed to more. So therefore, it's not reasonable, unless you have really compelling proof, and you don't, that the Rambam would disagree with the other Rishonim. The Rambam agrees with the other Rishonim that for most of the pregnancy, the child is not a nefesh. It's a very critical point. We have to let that sink in. What the Rambam is only saying is that once the woman goes into labor, Akar Havlad, and the Rambam has strong grounding in the Gemara in Erech and Dav Zayin. Right? The Gemara already says that once the woman goes into labor, you don't execute the woman. You wait for the child to give birth. So the Rambam has very strong grounding. Only once the mother goes into labor, or Akar Havlad, the Vlad has uprooted himself, that's when he assumes the status of nefesh, and that's when the Rambam said you can only kill him if he has the status of a rodef. So before Akar Havlad, he doesn't need the status of rodef. You can kill him to save a life. After he uproots himself, after Akar Havlad, then you need the svar of rodef. So the Rambam is not in contradiction with the Gemara. Right? The Rambam was talking about from the period of time between Akar Havlad and when the Uber exits the womb. When the Gemara said Lav Roidifu, was talking about after he exits the womb. Now, the second difficulty, what exactly happens? Right? That the Achiezer doesn't deal with. We've reconciled the Rambam. The Rambam is not a contradiction with the Gemara. But what exactly happens? What happened that before he exited, he has the status of Rodev? When he sticks his head out, he didn't have the access.
Why does he lose it?
Exactly. Why did he lose the status of Rodev? Okay, now the Rambam was a doctor, okay, and clearly, it's clear to me, and I'm not speaking in the capacity of a doctor, I'm speaking in the capacity of a Talmudist, a student of the Talmud. The Rambam clearly seems to have understood that before the child exits the womb, it's his activity, it's his active doings that causes the mother to be in danger. Once he exits, right, natural causes or only something that he had done in the past causes the woman to be in danger. I was curious to know if this could be reconciled with modern medicine or modern medical knowledge, right? So I did what everybody else does. Right? You go on to Google, right? Somebody was asking, why do you need to give Shurim anymore? Don't you have Google? Right? So I said, I'm giving Shurim so that when somebody goes into Google, will find me on YouTube. So anyways, okay. So I found one article about this. Okay, I'll hand it out if anybody's interested, and I repeat myself. I say this with a great deal of humility, and if anybody's more knowledgeable about obstetrics, then they can give their input. But I saw something very interesting. First of all, the first thing that the report said is that there's a great lack of knowledge about what causes a death during childbirth. And they said the reason why it's so obscure is because today, death at childbirth is so rare, right? They quote here a doctor, right? If it matters to anybody what her name is, this is Barbara Levy, who's a medical doctor. She is the vice president of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, okay? So she points out that any hospital is unlikely to have seen a maternal death in the last 5 years. So which means to say that they point that there's a very great lack of data, right, to determine if a woman has hypertension, hemorrhages. They have all sorts of ways to deal with hemorrhages and hypertension, these things that would typically cause a woman to die during childbirth, right? But what the article did point out, this actually comes from another article, and I'm sorry that I didn't take down exactly the source, but anybody can find it easily, that obstetric emergencies, right, which means to say things that could cause the woman to die during the delivery, they say severe bleeding and amniotic fluid, which means too much, which means it's called amniotic fluid embolism, which means that the amniotic fluid enters into the mother's bloodstream. Okay, so which means to say during the actual delivery, what would most likely cause the death is either excessive bleeding, right, or the amniotic fluid getting into the mother's bloodstream. Who is causing that? The Uber, right? The fact that the Uber decided it's time to get out of here, right? I'd like to get out, right? That's his activity is causing that reality. After the birth, right? Postpartum, okay? There's a new set of rules over here, right? It's a different reality, right? There, right, also things the high blood pressure, hypertension, which could cause stroke. Infection is a major cause of postpartum death. Now, let's, for example, take the example of infection, right? His head is out. Now, in the opinion of the Rambam, I'm convinced, that says once the head is out, right, he's no longer rupturing any arteries, right? I suppose the Rambam believed, right? I don't speak in the capacity of a doctor, but it seems that the Rambam didn't believe that he's continuing to cause the amniotic fluids to get involved. That's something that already happened as a result, and that could, I guess, suppose be a reason because the largest part of the baby is the head, and that's the hardest part, I suppose, to get out. So the Rambam said, look, before the baby exits, he's trying to get out, and he's causing his mother excessive bleeding or whatever else, and he has the status of birth. Once his head is out, right, whatever's causing her to die is not something that he's actively doing now. It could have been something that he did in the past, right? It could be something that's happening indirectly of the birth, Okay? Why would they want to kill the baby? Maybe it's to get a point of access to operate. Okay? I'm being very, I'm putting a lot of conjecture over here. And again, I have to kind of do this because even the experts seem to say that we have no idea what's going on because they're so ruled out on the subject. So, but if anybody's more knowledgeable, I'm giving you something to look into. But in either way, what seems very clear, and I'm talking now as a student of the Talmud and as the doctor, the Rambam believed, right, that before the child exits his head, he has the status of Rodev. It's his direct activity, right? What time is it? Oh, we're almost done. It's his direct activity that's causing the mother to be in danger. Once his head is out, it's not his direct activity that's causing the mother to be in danger, okay? So in other ways, the Rambam is clear, okay? The case is to be made in favor of the Achiezer, okay? Which, by the way, fits perfectly with the wording of the Gemara. Mishamai karat filei. Once his head is out, Mishamai karat filei. The mother may be in danger as a result of something that he had done, but at this point, it's natural causes that's causing the mother to be in danger. Okay? So which means to say the Achiezer, this fits perfectly with the wording of the Rambam, and there's no reason to assert that the Rambam would disagree with the vast majority of Rishonim that say he's not a nefesh. Only once the mother goes into labor and the child starts to attempt to exit the uterus, that's when you need the svara of roidev. That's when you can only kill the child if he has the status of roidev, which occurs until he exits his head. Which leads me to this, by the way, this explanation. By the way, this is a completely original explanation of the Rambam. I have not found it written anywhere except for my Sefer. And it's, in my humble opinion, the only explanation of the Rambam which fits perfectly with the wording of the Gemara, okay, and which doesn't contradict all the other sources that made a very compelling case that the fetus is not an ovum. Okay. By the way, this reconciles something different. Okay, that there's another implication about a woman giving birth, in that it gives her the nida status. Okay, as the pasuk in the beginning of Parshas Tazria says, that birth alone gives the woman a status of a nida, of a menstrually impure woman, whether or not there's been a discharge of blood. Okay? So which means to say, even if theoretically, I don't know if such a thing could happen medically or not, but if a woman could give birth even without the slightest discharge of blood, she would still have the status of nida on account of having given birth. Okay, as stated in the pasuk. Now, at what point in time does she assume the nida status? The Mishnah Nida says, Mishayotze padachtoi, when the forehead is exited. Once the forehead has exited the uterus, okay, the woman assumes the nida status. In the Mishnah of Allah, the Mishnah didn't say that. The Mishnah said when the head exits. So the Bartanura and the Tiferet Yisrael and all the Mefarshim say, I suppose that the Mishnah wasn't being particular, the Mishnah wasn't being exacting with its language, and presumably the Mishnah meant the forehead and it said the head. Right? But the Rambam, who's a codifier of halacha, which you would expect him to be much more clear, right? When he records the halacha in Ilchas Isrei Biot, when he records the halacha of a woman becoming a nida, padachtoi, he says the forehead, according to the correct Girsa of the Kesef Mishnah there. When it comes to the Mishnah Alas in Ilchas Ritzicha, the Rambam says the head. So I think the reason is very simple, because when determining the status of a mother who's in nida, you have to know what is the definition of birth. According to the halacha, the definition of birth is when the forehead completely comes out, which is considered the majority of the head. If the forehead is out, it means the majority of the head is out. That's defined as birth. But here the Rambam was not talking about, in Hilchos Ritzicha, the Rambam was not dealing with a halachic perspective, what is halachic birth, what is not halachic birth. He was dealing from a medical perspective. At what point, right, is the child no longer actively endangering the mother, which, by the way, explains this discrepancy, and I haven't seen anybody that has bothered to explain the discrepancy between the two Rambams, which fits beautifully. So I've made a strong case here, I think, humbly. I think I've made a strong case here, and on behalf of the Achiezer, which now has major implications. Right? We're going to, from now on, assume, right, in accordance with the Achiezer of Chaim Ozer Grudensky, that the Rambam doesn't disagree with the other Rishonim that until labor, the child does not have the status of a nefesh. Okay? Which will bring us to the next section of the Shir, which will be the third section. I hope it'll be 3, maybe 4, right? Which will say, okay, if the child doesn't have the status of a nefesh, at least until labor of the so why exactly is abortion prohibited? Okay, what is exactly the prohibition of abortion? Now, we know the prohibition. We know that abortion is prohibited because of the Gemara in Sanhedrin Zayin. It's number 43 in your reference sheet, right? Just as a quick introduction, right? Obviously, there's vastly more scenarios where a Jew could be subject to capital punishment. Shabbat, I'm saying there are many more cases under which a Jew could be subject to execution, unlike a non-Jew. But there are some exceptions, a number of exceptions, where, unlike most cases, we're more stringent with non-Jews, and one of them is murder. By the way, Gezel, exactly. By the way, this makes sense. There's a fascinating introduction from Rabbi Nissim going to the Shas. I strongly encourage people to go through it. It's also the Ran in Drashas, the 2 Rans, Rabbi Nissim going and the Ran in Drashas Aran. They both say the same principle, that the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach operate according to a different system than the entire mitzvahs. They're 2 different operating systems. He calls them the Mishpat HaTorani and the Mishpat HaMedini. He says the Mishpat HaTorani is 613 mitzvahs, which operates according to, if you like, a science. Okay? There's a certain science. Torah has a certain system, right? Divine system, and it operates. It's completely objective, right? It cannot be changed. I mean, okay, the Torah, the Torah B'Shamayim, the Matan Torah, the Chachamim were given that license to interpret it. But whatever it is, it works according to a certain Torah science, if you like. He says that the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is called the Mishpat HaMedini. Right? The Mishpat HaMedini means it's in order to uphold law and order. That there should be able to be a functioning society, like the Mishnah Avos says, that people should swallow each other alive, and that's why it operates according to a different system. And he says a king also, even a Jewish king, has the right, has the prerogative to operate according to the Mishpat HaMedini, and that's why the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that a king could kill without Eidim and Hatra'ah. So that gives a little bit of context to understand why the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach operate a little bit different aspect when it comes to things like theft. And things like murder, they could execute based on circumstantial evidence, Eid Mipi Eid, right? We're much more permissive according. It's interesting that Moshe Feinstein was asked by the governor of New York as to whether he wanted an opinion from Rav Moshe. It's printed in the Igros Moshe. I don't have the source with me. The governor of New York asked Rav Moshe to issue an opinion about capital punishment. Okay, Rav Moshe Feinstein said, in principle, it's not a good thing to execute people, but if it's necessary in order to maintain law and order, then it should be. And then there's a big debate if it really is conducive to maintaining law and order. That's a debate which doesn't get into, it's not related to our discussion. But in any case, Rabbi Shmuel, the Tanna Kama lists a few stringencies that pertain to the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Number one judge could issue the capital punishment. It could be done even if there was no warning, prior warning. According to the Mishpat HaTorah, you can only execute a person if the aid and the witnesses give prior warning. Even relatives, you can even accept the testimony of relatives. Okay? Rabbi Shmuel, there, 4th line from the bottom, adds another stringency. Af alahu barim, right? The Noach could be killed even for killing a fetus. Right? So according to the Mishpat HaTorah, killing a fetus is not murder. According to the Mishpat HaMedini, it's considered murder, right? In other words, if you look at it in the context of law and order, killing a fetus could be, in that sense, could be considered. So there's a very important principle. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf from Test says the principle there's nothing that's permissible for a Gentile that's prohibited for a Gentile, but it's permissible for a Jew. So therefore, if a non-Jew could potentially be executed for killing a fetus, there's no way that it could be permissible for a Jew. So therefore, we definitely established that it must be abortion must be prohibited. But now that we've determined that it's not a nefesh, and certainly according to the way Achiezer asserts that at least according to labor, even the Rambam agrees he's not a nefesh. So what is the basis to prohibit abortion? That will be the next section of the shir, section 3 of our shir on abortion, and we'll see that it's divided up into 4 categories. Just to give you a little bit of a teaser, excuse me, I'm a little bit over time. The first one is Shechazeh Lavatala, destroying seed, right? Which, according to our Archman, is rooted in the Yisr of Bal Tashtis, right? Destructive activity. The second was Chabala, one's not allowed to injure oneself, right? So certainly if it's part of the mother, it's certainly injuring oneself. The other one is that it decreases life, Titlapir Viridia. And also we'll see at length next year that the child has monetary rights, right? He could receive inheritances. So therefore, if the child has a right to receive money, surely he has a right to live, and we have no right to take that life from him. We'll examine each of these topics in length. Okay, so we'll finish over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good.
Okay.
Good.
All right.